Well, friends, you know that today was supposed to be a day of celebration, 20 years of service for Lisa Stanger, but unfortunately, illness took over and changed our plans. So I am mixing things up. We are mixing things up a little bit, but in a way carrying on in the same vein of that 20th anniversary. Indeed, I had come across a sermon, a 20th anniversary sermon that was only possible to be delivered by one pastor of this congregation to date. In all the 200 years of this congregation, only one pastor made it past 20 years, made it to a 20-year anniversary. Anybody have an idea who that was? Some of you are saying Bob Curtis. He was almost there. 19 years of service for Bob Curtis. Doug Ray. Doug Ray, the only other pastor who is mentioned on our church website other than our currently serving pastor. The only pastor who has a portrait of him hanging on the walls of this building. The only pastor to have the air of saint that comes along with him when you bring his name. The website says, you know, if you've been around First United long enough, and I don't know when this was written, but it's that you've probably heard the name Doug Ray. And even if you are a newer person, maybe you've heard the name Doug Ray. Maybe you found us on the website, so you're like, who's this Doug Ray guy who started serving in the 1930s and served up through the 1960s and seems to have been the only pastor of note within the life of this congregation? Well, part of the reason that is because, friends, he served 33 years in this role, in this congregation. Part of that is because prior to him, the longest serving pastor was 9 years. There were many, many, many pastors that were a year in service. Some at 3 or 4. One even made it to 9 years prior to Doug coming here. And even after him, nobody quite met that mark. Bob Curtis being pretty close, and I know some of you have some feels about that. But Doug Ray was the person who was serving at a pivotal time in the life of this congregation and in the life of this nation. Doug Ray was serving when this church was built, this building came into being. Doug Ray was there when the Christian Center, which was then later called Monroe County United Ministries and now Pathways, he was serving as minister then and was very active in that work. Doug Ray was the pastor who was serving when the UCC, a gathering of faithful folks from IU's ministry, came to worship in the chapel here. So I think Doug Ray is more than just the guy we liked the best in our history, but he is a part of the foundation of who we are as a congregation. And as I was reading, some of you know, again, I've been reading The Never-Ending Story with Jabali, which seems to be a never-ending effort because we only read so many pages each night, but we're nearing it. We're almost to the end. As I was reading that with him just this week, there was a moment, there was a time when Bastian was in the city of old emperors, and he learned that when you have no past, you have no future. Without a past, there is no future. So friends, today I invite you to listen to these words, some of them a bit antiquated in my perspective, and perhaps in y'all's perspective, but I am going to read his words. You can change some of those words in your mind if you need to. This is a sermon that he delivered on the occasion of his 20th anniversary as pastor of this congregation of First Baptist Church, Bloomington, Indiana, delivered on September 25th, so almost 70 years ago. He writes, he proclaims, Because today is the day it is, I want to take great liberties with the purpose and tradition of the Christian pulpit and share with you something of my own personal life before coming to Bloomington. Without our 20 years of friendship and our trust in one another, what I am about to do would be in questionable taste. The relationship of a minister to his congregation, like a good marriage, is a long conversation between him and his people. You might have caught a few words that I'd like to change. And its greatest strength comes from our understanding each other, knowing where we came from, what turned and twisted us, what made us the way we are. In the book of Acts, there is an account of Paul being received and led to prison for an entirely different kind of reception from what we think will happen at our reception this afternoon when they were going to be celebrating his 20th anniversary. The scripture reads, as Paul was about to be brought into the barracks, he said, "May I say a word?" And when they granted him permission, he said, "I am a man which am a Jew, born in Tarsus, a city in Cilicia, a citizen of no mean city, brought up at the feet of Gamaliel, educated according to the strict manner of our fathers." That little speech tells a lot about Paul, that he was first and last a Jew, that he was a city boy, that he was highly educated by Gamaliel, and that he had strict moral home training. In any understanding of Paul, his writings, and his life work, these facts help us to interpret his prejudices and to be sympathetic to his weaknesses. In brief, to make allowances. The Christian minister needs the same kind of introduction. Like a newspaper editorial, the minister's sermon bears the slant, the prejudices, the weaknesses of the minister himself. If you know under what flag he flies in something of his personal history, you know how to discount him, how to make allowances for his pride and his bias, and I hope how to forgive him. The French have a saying, to understand all is to forgive all, i.e., if you know all there is to know about the circumstances of a life, you will understand and be forgiving. To paraphrase George Nathan's cynical entence about children, children begin by loving their parents, then they judge them, sometimes they forgive them. Churches begin by loving their ministers, then they judge them. We're in that stage, I guess, according to his timeline. Sometimes they forgive them. This morning, I hope we are entering that third stage. There is nothing unusual about my boyhood, Doug Ray writes, or any one of the 27 years before coming to Bloomington. As for the last 20 years, there is nothing different from that of thousands of ministers all over the country. My mother came from Ireland, where my Scotch father was a twinkle in his eyes, insisted all the world's trouble was brewed. His father insists all the world's trouble was brewed there in Ireland. She was a nurse, a supervisor in the Dublin lying-in hospital. She was full of Irish wit and an uncommon selflessness. My mother died just short of 70, but she never grew old, nor did she ever lose her sense of humor. My father came from Dumfries, Scotland. He met my mother in Dublin, where he was employed as a cabinet maker in the shipyards. In the spring of 1906, he booked passage for South Africa. But the week before he was to sail, fortunately for me and unfortunately for you, he went home to say goodbye to his parents. And that week, his mother literally talked him out of going so far away. I can remember him telling how she said, "Hugh, I dinna ken muckle about South Africa, but if you have to be gone away from here, I'd rather you be going to America." Apologies for the accent. He writes it in here as best he can. In June, he sailed from Glasgow for New York, and that same summer, he sent for my mother. On Labor Day, they were married. Her Irish wit would never let him forget that he had married her on Labor Day and that she had had to work ever since. I, that is Doug, was born in 1908, just 5 blocks east of the Cathedral of St. John the Divine. As my Puritan mother explained it, under a bush in Morningside Park. That was the year the largest meteor on record fell on Siberia and tore a 25-mile hole in the earth. Here in America, that same year, we added another star to the flag for Oklahoma. It was also the year in which, because of atmospheric dust, sunsets in Europe turned bright green instead of red. On the day I was born, May 29th, Senator La Follette from Wisconsin talked for 18 hours in the Senate, and my poor mother lost all her hair, literally lost all her hair. That summer, the Bloomington Masons helped lay the cornerstone for the Monroe County Courthouse, and when I feel particularly old, I walk around that ancient building, observing the cracks and tobacco juice, and leave feeling 10 years younger. I think I have stood up to the weather better than the limestone. When I was 3 years old, my mother was desperately homesick, and so she and I sailed to the Caledonia for a visit home to Ireland. It was the only time of 6 crossings that I wasn't sick. The food was excellent. Remember, he's 3 months old. Did I say 3 years old? He was 3 months old. The first day out of New York, I distinguished myself. My mother had left the carriage in charge of a teenager. A groundswell caught the girl off guard and the carriage off balance and threw us both down a full flight of stairs into the center of the crowded dining room. For the next 10 minutes, I gave evidence of having the first requirement for being a minister, plenty of lung power. According to my mother, my first dinner speech brought the whole crowd to their feet. When I was 7, I was enrolled in Public School 46, just above the polo grounds. On the first day, I fell in love with my teacher, but not with school itself. When I was 9, the Sinn Féin rebellion broke out in Ireland, and the rest of the world was discovering a new phrase, World War. That summer of 1917, in spite of submarines, we sailed again for Ireland, this time to spend a year and attend the Irish school of Wicklow. When we returned, America was in the war, and I, along with the other boys, sold war bonds and collected peach pits for the filters on gas masks. At this point in my development, the last 2 years of grade school, I was beginning to discover some of my limitations. I did not grow as fast as the other boys. In fact, I was so small until I was 17 that my nickname was Insect. Saint Insect? Sounds pretty good, I guess. In schoolwork, my marks were hardly passing. As for athletics, I was so small and so poorly coordinated that when we chose sides for baseball, football, or Wannacat, no idea what that is. Anybody have an idea what that could be? All right, we'll have to look it up. I played only if they were short of players. I was the least likely to be chosen. As I look back on those years in grade school and high school, I think it was my limitations and my failings that made the church such a bright spot. It was a little prefabricated Sears Roebuck mission church with about 15 adult members. The minister, a layman, was an Englishman, really what the Episcopalians would call a lay reader. He was, however, in the finest sense, a man of God. Even now, when I look back through the critical eyes of an adult, he still lives up to that definition. He was, however, a fanatical fundamentalist, not in the fire-eating brimstone tradition, but in his own quiet Christian way. He held to a strict literal reading of the Bible, and it wasn't long before I was reading it his way and telling his way and believing what he believed. The little church was over a mile from our house, and though I was the only member of our family attending, I never missed. This little congregation of 15 adults and 5 or 6 children became the real center of my life. I can still see the 16 of us sitting around in a semicircle about the communion table, with Mr. Lynn serving the bread and wine himself, and each of us taking turns leading in prayer. As I look back on it now, this was not only the taproot of my Christian faith, but here, with these serious-minded adults, I found relief for my sense of failure. Here in the church, I wasn't insect. Here I wasn't the last one chosen for the team. Here there were no report cards with D's and F's to take home. Surrounded by the love and warmth of these simple Christians, my life began to take meaning. There was a point to it. By this time, my father had graduated from his cabinet making and had become a building contractor. The post-war boom in building had moved us up a notch or two in the economic scale, if not the social ladder. I remember the day he drove home in a brand new Petersen Jackrabbit automobile, the first car with a gear shift on the steering wheel. He had paid cash for it, and he was proud as only the Scotch can be proud. I was up in the back bedroom when he drove in the driveway, and in my innocence, I knelt down and prayed God never to allow him to become rich. I don't know that that prayer had anything to do with the Depression, which followed 2 years later in 1929. At least I never wrote President Hoover about it. And of course, I never told my father about my powerful prayer. In 1927, I entered William Jewell College, one of our Baptist colleges just outside Kansas City, Missouri. 3 things happened there that became real turning points in my life. First, I began to study in earnest. Up to this point, school had been a necessary evil, and certainly not a pleasant evil. Now the pieces of the puzzle began to fit together. I had a good reason for work. Latin, English, Greek, and history had a place in the training of a minister. At last, I was learning how to study and how to work. The second thing that happened was a byproduct. I began to be critical about ideas, books, professors. Christian doctrines about the Bible and God, which I had defended with more emotion and heat than sound reason, took a different color. I say things differently. My readings outside the classroom introduced me to a whole new way of thinking. It wasn't anything to write home about, but my alleged mind was taking on a more critical edge. The third significant turn concerned a point of view about the work of the church. The weekends, Saturday and Sunday, I spent on the west side of Kansas City, working in a slum area. And for all 4 years, 2 of them Depression years, I never missed a Sunday serving a poverty-stricken group of people in a mission church. Undoubtedly, I may have been running away from some of the social adjustments of college life. I, however, was learning firsthand about the kind of problems the middle-class Protestant churches often dodge. I was learning about people, how to listen. I like to think that the major emphasis of my particular ministry was shaped by this mission work on the west side of Kansas City, just across from the stockyards. I now knew more certainly than ever that I wanted to be a minister. More than this, I knew the kind of minister I wanted to be. Even though today, after 20 years of preaching, I am still a long way from what I'd like to be. If there is any single spot where the seed was sown, where my interest in social concern, in racial problems, in the Christian center, in political action take root, it was here. This is where the twig was bent. By the fall of 1931, everybody had forgotten about my high school grades in French and 2 or 3 other unmentionable subjects. And by some miracle, I was admitted for graduate study to Yale University and the Divinity School. Here I came to know intimately 6 very mature professors: Richard Niebuhr, Kenneth S. Latourette, Halford Locock, Douglas Clyde McIntosh, Roland Bainton, and Robert Calhoun. All 6 of these men were in their prime and had real stature in the world of scholarship. All 6 were Christians of high order. At the beginning, their points of view were often the exact opposite of my own. There was, however, no question about their Christian witness and their Christian spirit. They were men of both great tolerance and deep convictions. They were mature. These were the men who became my intellectual and spiritual parents. These were the men who molded and shaped my mind, who disturbed me, stirred me, and finally set me running under my own steam, set me off on my own religious pilgrimage. In 1934, I took my theological degree, and then partially because no church wanted me, I stayed on for a 4th year of graduate study. This was the year I met the teacher who was to teach me more than all the others together. This was the year I met Catherine, his wife. Without making her blush or making you turn around to see if she's blushing, this is the teacher who has done more in the making of this particular minister than any other single person. If you think you have had to put up with me for 20 years, this is the person who has had to, quote, carry her cross daily to put up with my moods, my depressions, my self-doubts, my pride, my stubbornness, my selfishness. If you think it is hard to listen to a preacher for 20 minutes a week, I guess he preached 20 minutes a week too, y'all. What do you think it must be like to live with a walking sermon 7 days a week, 365 days of the year? If in my ministry there is any real warmth, any significant insights into human nature, any real depth, much of the credit must go to this teacher who lives with me. 20 years ago, on an August afternoon, that was in 1935, Catherine helped me pack my trunk. As I filled out the label with the name of the First Baptist Church, Bloomington, Indiana, I remember saying to her, "You know, this is my first church. The important label will be the one which we write the name on the next church. This week, we are going to see the plans of that next church. Friends, we are gathered in that next church." 20 years ago, this very Sunday, the 4th Sunday of September 1935, I preached on the subject, the new church. Let me close with the exact words I used that Sunday. "This morning we are builders," I said. "We stand in a little circle of light. Round about us is the darkness of a world now going mad. Round about us is the darkness of men and women and nations caught in their own fears and greed. Faith in us in this place will be the courage to push out into the darkness and build the church of God, trusting that he who is the God of our light is the God of the darkness too." I concluded that 20-year-old sermon with these words: "The need for the coming year in our church is courage. Courage to push out. Courage to build here in Bloomington a new kind of church." Friends, some of you are aware that when Doug Ray left this church, when he retired in 1968, he was not long for this world, and he died a few weeks later. Friends, this is the church he served. This is the church that he helped lay foundation for. And so it is upon us, as the only church that he served, to recall, to honor his legacy, to continue that work, to continue to be builders of that church that he envisioned, that he understood the divine calling him in this place, calling his ancestors, as we heard in the letter that he wrote to us 75 years ago, to hear his words, to build on the ministry that he inspired, that he began here in Bloomington. So friends, let us meditate, let us reflect on the words and on the ministry. And friends, you are welcome to take a stroll before you go down to the potluck this morning, down to Roger Williams Hall to take a look at the man himself, if you would like. Friends, I invite you to engage in a moment of quiet reflection, a moment of meditation, a moment of prayer. Let us be together now for a brief moment of pause.